Welcome to Moving Medicine Forward, a podcast presented by CTI Clinical Trial and Consulting Services. This podcast is centered on advancements in healthcare and elevating individual stories and their expertise. I'm your host, Jeremy Schran, and together with my co-host, Raina Graham,
hello,
we will take you through a deep dive of CTI, clinical research, the patient journey, and much more. Today on the podcast, we have another great episode with our CEO, Tim Schroeder, and CTI board member, Dr. Bill Fitzsimmons. This time, we focus in on diversity in clinical trials and why it is so very important to our industry.
I'm really happy to have a longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Bill Fitzsimmons, joining us today on the CTI podcast. Bill and I have known each other for too many years to count, but it's certainly more than 20 years and probably closer to 30 now.
More than 30.
More than 30. He'll keep me honest on all my comments today. I've known Bill, since his time in the earliest days of Fujisawa Healthcare, which ultimately became part of Astellas, which is now one of the 15 largest and most influential pharmaceutical companies in the world. Bill held a number of really important leadership roles there across everything from clinical operations, regulatory affairs, quality assurance, even business development at one time, and really was the, if you think of the leading drug in transplantation, he actually was the scientific mastermind, coupled with a couple of other friends of ours who led the commercial side of taking that drug from basically research to approval to becoming the standard of care. So on one hand, the rareness of getting a drug approved, and then ultimately once you get it approved, to actually get it to be commercially successful and become the standard for treating patients. Bill really led so many aspects of that. And then on top of his professional accomplishments, he is genuinely one of the nicest, most honest, professional people that you will ever meet.
Much too kind. It's my pleasure.
That's great.
Thank
and
you.
That shows really your background and kind of how you got here. But how did you get tied with CTI? How did you get to where you are today in your clinical journey?
Well, I spent 29 years at Fujisawa and Astellas and retired from there in 2019. And I really wanted to leverage my experiences and hopefully learnings and some expertise in drug development, clinical trials, and regulatory in other ways beyond that corporate environment at Astellas. And Tim was kind enough to reach out and ask if I would join the board here at CTI.
Yeah. Are you able to share anything about what your role is on the board? How you help with the pharmaceutical component of it?
From my perspective, and Tim, I welcome your thoughts on this. Our board is a diverse group of individuals. Many of them are from the Cincinnati area, so I'm from Chicago, so I give the non-Cincinnati view. And many of them have backgrounds in other areas, not biopharmaceutics. So I can come in with the perspective of a former sponsor working on clinical trials and drug development, which most of the other board members don't have.
Great. Yeah, you mentioned diversity, which I think is going to be the main theme of today's talk. We're going to talk about the importance of diversity in clinical research. Do you mind defining what diversity is as we're talking through it in terms of clinical research? What does that look like, defining the topic at hand?
Diversity in general can take many different aspects, some of which we see externally and we know, and some we don't know. But in terms of clinical research, I think that focusing diversity is to say, are the trials that we're performing with new and innovative therapies representative of the patients in need of those therapies? And therefore, are they diverse enough to serve the patients that we're trying to treat once a new therapy is on the market?
So why is it such an important part of clinical research?
Yeah. I think to me, one of the keys is if we're developing a new drug, do we know that it's safe and efficacious in the various populations that will be treated with it? Are we making it available even at an investigational stage to patients who are in need? And once it's on the market, do the people who are going to be receiving it, can they trust that the data that we generated is generalizable to their situation? And diversity is important for all of those. And above and beyond that, it's just the right thing to do, right? To make sure that we're making our therapies available to everybody, regardless of race, color, age, sex, If they need it, we have an innovative therapy for them.
And I think just to add some additional color to that, if you think about it, if you're developing a treatment in a general medical disorder, say it's a seizure disorder, say it's cholesterol lowering, say it's high blood pressure you're trying to treat. If you think about that, typically there's millions of people that have those disorders. Some have pre-existing conditions or certain age, certain gender, certain race are more predisposed to certain conditions for multiple reasons. But if you think about that, in some ways, when you go to do drug development, what you want to do is you want to increase your opportunity for success as much as possible. So we do have a strategy with sometimes called enrichment, where you will actually have inclusion or exclusion criteria that will push people into a study or exclude them from a study based on certain criteria. To Bill's point, when you are finished with a study like that, you have what you have. Meaning if you exclude old people and young people and you only have middle-aged people in a study, that's what you have data on. Mm-hmm. If you only include males, you don't have any female data, that's what you have data on. And then by definition, you go before the regulatory authorities and try to get an approval. And you might get an approval, but you're going to have a very restrictive approval. And then ultimately, real world happens, which is, guess what? Older people and younger people need this treatment. Females need this treatment, using my example, et cetera. And so in some ways, it's a challenging thing to say, how do I try to develop a drug and have it be the highest opportunity for success? But then at the same time, once I'm approved, I want to have the broadest indication, which basically is the approval that the agencies give me. And what many of the companies do, obviously, is they may start with a certain age group, or they may start with a certain gender or race, whatever, and then obviously expand that over time. And obviously you get into issues, of course, in our scenario with CTI, where we do so much rare disease research, or you do so much research that's innovative or cutting edge. It's hard to know when you're developing the fifth drug in a class. It's pretty easy to know who to include and who to exclude, what endpoints to use, et cetera. We have some really unique opportunities and challenges because of the fields that we tend to work in.
Right. Bill, you mentioned earlier, and I think you can both speak to this, is one of the leading barriers to clinical trial diversity is medical distrust. So how do you, on the front end, get individuals to join the trial and then trust that the data is accurate and represents a full diverse group of individuals? And how, as a CRO, can we make sure that we're working towards getting that diversity and trust in patients?
I think trust is something that is earned, and it's earned over time. So it takes a lot of small steps that have to be deliberate and intentional, but it's not going to come automatically. So what we have to do as a healthcare community, as a CRO, is we have to start making deposits into the trust bank, so to speak. And to do that is going to investigators who reflect the racial and ethnic makeup of the patients, right? We have to choose sites that are in their communities or in medical centers where they're seeking care for underrepresented populations. We have to develop trial materials that are appropriate for their health literacy, for the language that they speak, and various other aspects. We have to actually engage patients and participants and advocacy groups into designing our trials so that we don't sit in our building and come up with this wonderful scientific protocol that when we go out and try to implement it, people say, I can't come to my doctor's office that often. I don't want all these tests. Why are you drawing my blood every week? Whatever. We tend to do that in isolation. We need to partner and engage with them. And that engagement goes beyond just the potential participants, but really to the community at large, so that we continue to build that trust in the community. When we come back for additional trials, they'll know CTI, the biopharmaceutical industry, actually is an industry that can be trusted, a company that can be trusted to participate in a trial, to protect my data, to provide me a trial that is convenient for me to participate in.
And just to add a little bit of historical context, for any of your podcast listeners that, maybe want to delve into something beyond what's happening today. But if they Google the word Tuskegee experiment or Tuskegee investigation, long before drug development was regulated, there were research studies which would not in any way comply with what we think are either regulatory or ethical standards today, where individuals were not even consented or educated that they were participating in a study and were given treatments that ultimately had very detrimental impact to their health. And in that particular case, it was very much focused around African Americans. And so I think some of the trust that Dr. Fitzsimmons is referring to that needs to be overcome today is there is a rationale and a history behind it. Now, I would say, like anything, the regulations and the knowledge and experience and intent, I think, has changed dramatically. That thing about Tuskegee was getting close to 100 years ago. But that doesn't mean that mistrust isn't present and hasn't been carried forward. And sometimes, the mistrust is based on lack of education. And so I think there's a real opportunity. And I think COVID, as polarizing and challenging as the COVID world was those first couple of years, it really highlighted research. And I think we may delve into this in more detail, later in this podcast, but it was a really good example of, in a very short period of time, the pharmaceutical industry, the government, academic medical centers, researchers, services like ourselves at CTI banded together to say, how quickly can we, in a thoughtful, meaningful, and as regulated environment as we possibly can, move things forward at a much quicker pace than they're used to. And I think one of the things that we saw there, that was a ripe opportunity for diversity. If you remember, just to highlight the vaccine trials, the first vaccine trials with Pfizer and Moderna were very quickly into the clinic, very quickly enrolling, and were very public about who was enrolling and trying to do it in the safest way, but the most expeditious way. One of the things we found very quickly is certain ages, certain ethnicities were dramatically underrepresented in those early studies, which then the issue of trying to understand and interpret the outcome, if you don't have a represented population, you don't have the ability to say this is safe or efficacious as it is in the populations that are already there. So I think that was a real learning lesson for us as society, and a lot of good things happened despite the bad things around COVID, around diversity. And certainly at CTI, we had a number of opportunities to really utilize our knowledge and experience around diversity to try to make sure we had representative data to draw conclusions from.
Yeah, we had a great discussion with Adam Roth, who runs our site, about the vaccine trials and COVID, and how they learned a lot from the COVID research time, and they're still implementing some of those things that they learned during COVID, and has really made our site really great for vaccine trials. So if you want to check out that episode, I'll put it in the show notes so you can link if you missed that one.
What are some of the unique challenges associated with ensuring diversity is present in clinical trials? I mean, so you're working with rare diseases, you're working with small patient populations, but what are some of the other challenges that come up with ensuring diversity?
I think from my perspective and the sponsor side, one of the challenges to diversity in our trials is that we focus so much on speed and cost, right? And we then look at the diversity after the trial's done and say, well, did we complete it on time? Did we complete it within budget? And here's what the diversity looks like. And so people worry about taking time or spending additional money that they perceive as important to or needed in order to make their trials more diverse. With that is the site location, mainly from a country perspective. One of my kind of pet peeves about clinical trials from the pharmaceutical industry is that we keep trying to enhance diversity within the US sites, which is great. But the reality is that over the last 2 years, if you look at enrollment in every novel new drug approved, the median enrollment from the US is 29%. So most of our enrollment, 70+% of patients are enrolled ex-US. So if we go to sites in Eastern Europe, as an example, we shouldn't be surprised that the participants in their trials don't look racially and ethnically like the US population. It's not a surprise. What we need to do is onshore, so to speak, is Rob Califf's term for bringing more and more studies into the US, which is challenging because we don't necessarily have the infrastructure at some of our centers. People are worried about the cost of doing that. But the only way we're going to really move the needle on having trial participation that looks like US population is actually do it in the US.
Right, and have that diversity from the US in there. Do you think that regulation and having strict requirements for diverse populations would help or hurt that process?
So I do think it will help. And one of the questions that you asked earlier was about why this is important. And I want to touch on that. The FDA has really stepped up in their focus on diversity. And within the next days, weeks, maybe months, there's going to be a new FDA guidance on diversity in clinical trials, which once it's finalized, will make it mandatory for sponsors to have a diversity action plan to start their pivotal trials. So it's going to push the sponsors to do this because they have to do it. However, I look at that as that's the stick, right, to try to mandate it. I believe that we should also have a carrot. We should incentivize companies. As an example, it's kind of a wild idea I have is that if they have a diversity action plan and they actually enroll a diverse population, provide them priority review for their NDA or BLA. I guarantee you sponsors will go after it if they're incentivized because they're going to help the timeline. Priority review vouchers, which now can be gained for different types of activities and development and then sold to other companies, sell on average for $100 million right now. So we know a priority review is worth $100 million compared to a standard review.
It's incredible. So Bill, though, just to take that thought a little bit further, it's interesting in my mind, all diversity is not created equal. So a diverse population, according to the FDA, is not necessarily a diverse population according to EMA. And I was struck, for instance, I was visiting the CTI offices in the Middle East, North Africa, just about 3 weeks ago. And I happened to be in Riyadh a day where literally we were doing an initiation visit for a gene therapy for sickle cell. And as you well know, there are certain genetic predispositions. And if you look at hematological disorders, sickle cell, beta thal, et cetera, there's no question the Mediterranean, North Africa, Middle East population has a predisposition to it. So in some regard, it makes sense to take your clinical development programs to where those patients are and where there's the highest concentration. Now, there's a bit of a trade-off as to, and it was interesting, that particular example, without going into anything confidential, actually received approval by the local authorities in less than 30 days, which was their fastest record. And they actually talked about it at the conference that we were there sponsoring. But I say it only in the context of, typically pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies are developing drugs for two reasons. One, to help mankind, and two, to make money for their shareholders. And that's not always the order that they think of things. And so in some ways, if you think of diversity and the issue of I'm going to go where the patients are, or where the key opinion leaders are that actually tend to treat most of those patients, it's not always where the commercial success is going to be. And I'm just curious how you see those two things of not being counterbalanced to each other, how that can be thought of.
I think it's a great example of the complexity of doing this in a multinational environment. We need, if we're a global company, we need to serve patients regardless of their geopolitical boundaries, right? A patient who has a disease and is on the other side of the border, doesn't matter. It's still a patient that we need to serve. So I think we do have to go to where the patients are that need. But we can't do it because that's a cheaper, easier place to go. That's actually, to some extent, exploiting the patients. And one of the concerns over some of the diversity initiatives is, will this push sponsors to go to Africa to do trials so that they can say they have a Black population, or go to Brazil to do trials to say they have Hispanic representation? Is that the right thing to do, or is that just is that a good thing or a bad thing from the standpoint of getting trials done with a more diverse population?
One of the things that's important to think about in terms of getting diversity into clinical trials is not just focusing on hospitals and academic centers that are in city centers, but going to, smaller community centers that might going where the patients are and finding, wide range of patients. But what is needed in order to kind of build that infrastructure and ensure that those sites are supported and that sponsors are providing support, or the FDA is providing support for success in getting those diversity from those centers?
I think the word you used was infrastructure, which to me is the first thing I think of, because there might be some community centers that have done clinical trials before, but I think it's a small minority. And just having the staff that are available because they're very busy to do clinical research, that know the important parts about being GCP compliant, and documentation and other things, can be quite a lift for a given center. So what we have to do is support them as much as we can, particularly if they're going to be a center that's going to be in recurring trials. And that's the beauty of it. You can, if you build the people, the tools, the infrastructure at a site, they can then replicate that. So if you have a community-based oncology site, which are quite common, a lot of people are treated there, they can continue to do trials after you get their infrastructure set up. But it takes, the first time doing it, it's going to take a lot. And that's what I find, what I found in speaking with some of the sites that have particularly diverse populations, is they have the smallest infrastructure and staffing available. So they'd say, we'd love to do this. We can't. We're overwhelmed just trying to treat the patients that walk in the door.
Right. And how, as a CRO, can we help ensure that we're playing a role in building that infrastructure and making sure they have the support they need?
Well, I think, hearkening back to what we were talking about earlier with COVID, I think there were some really good examples there, right? To Bill's earlier comments, I think, people like to see people that look like themselves. And I think that's true in the case of research as well. So for instance, when we were talking about COVID research, in addition to being a CRO, CTI is a research site itself. We have our own recruiting group. Our recruiting group is led by an African-American woman. And I think she was particularly effective in guiding the recruiting team and the marketing team to say, if we're trying to identify minorities to participate in studies, we need to think in terms of what TV stations, what radio, what social media, what about Latino markets, what about African American churches and schools and things like that. And so, to Bill's comment, I think we've got to think in terms of not where are sites located, what is the catchment area as far as the diversity of the population, but then even once that's, we can have some place that maybe doesn't have a high percentage of a particular population, but they're really good at identifying the ones that are there and screening and educating them about a study, and therefore their enrollment rates are higher. So I think there's more than one way to approach it relative to how do you make sure you end up with a diverse population. What I think we don't do particularly well as a society, and especially in research, is we don't learn lessons from each other well. And so I think best practices, and this may be a place to your question of where can CROs help in this space, it's sharing best practices, it's maybe mandating best practices, and highlighting investigators, sites, CROs, pharma companies that do it really well. I don't know what, I would think, to me, for instance, with this being such a high priority in society and at places like the FDA, should we not think in terms of whether it's publications, whether it's award ceremonies, whether it's financial incentives, as was mentioned before, all those things. I think individually they may have minimal effects. When you think about adding them together, you might see an effect that's much bigger than we would anticipate.
You mentioned educating the trial participants, but we know another leading barrier to clinical trial diversity is limited health and research literacy. How can we help that? How can we make it so that these patients can get educated on the studies, and how do we reach out to them and do that or train them and educate them on these studies?
I think one of the easy ways is ensuring that the study materials are written to the right health literacy level. And there are groups that do that very well as their business. And we think we're writing something that's to the right literacy level, but we don't know, right? Because that's not what we do for a business. But we have to be able to address what does the customer need, so to speak. And the customer here is the potential trial participant. And if they can't read the materials and can't understand the materials, then they're useless. Right? And we just have to go, there are tools out there. I always look at it as there's lots of tools. We just have to start using some of them and use them smartly. And health literacy tools are one of them that we have to, whether it's an informed consent, whether it's study materials, all those things, both language and health literacy are important. And giving them people who can speak to them at their literacy level, who can speak to them in their native language in addition to that.
And in some ways, Bill, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I think we tend to address most of the issues relative to, I have a study, what can I do now? And that's not a bad thing, but in addition to that, could you start a grassroots effort that literally goes to children and adolescents and young adults? And, just to highlight one of the examples I used before of a gene therapy that's now approved in the US and other places for sickle cell disease. In fact, two gene therapies, both approved in December in the US. If you think of sickle cell is a genetic disorder that has a high predisposition in African Americans in this country, and obviously African citizens of genetic predisposition elsewhere. If you've ever seen, heard, or know someone who has sickle cell, especially homozygous, where they have both genes from both parents, and they're symptomatic, at best they require transfusions once per month. At worst, they get sickle cell crises, which result in excruciating pain and, frankly, difficulty breathing that sometimes requires them to be in the intensive care unit on a ventilator. Okay, think about that and say, why don't we highlight the success here? We've now developed multiple treatments and possibly even a cure for sickle cell disease. And in order to do that, we've had to have the participation of the African American community in this country. So here's an example of, while it's recent and it's one that doesn't have a long history yet, to be able to tout. But I think there are multiple examples like that where we should be educating in the grade schools, in the high schools, in the universities to say this is a benefit of people of diverse backgrounds participating in studies. And we know certain diseases have predispositions. So I think we should educate to those diseases and to those populations and obviously highlight both the need and the success. I think what we tend to do as a society is we highlight where we fall short, which is fine, but also how do we, counterbalance that with the successes?
I believe this takes a village, right? It's not the CRO that's responsible for it. It's not the site. It's not the pharmaceutical company. It's not the FDA. It's all of us working together. So we all have to do our part. But it also takes deliberate action. So make a plan, implement the plan, monitor the plan, and take corrective action. Nobody gets it completely right. That's okay. We're not going to do everything perfect to start. We're going to continue to get better and better. But if we don't plan for it, it's not going to just happen by chance when we look at the results of our study. And when we enroll in a study, we need to monitor the diversity of the enrollees and the representatives in the study and make corrective actions if it's not going as we want it to go, rather than waiting till the end of the trial and go, we gave it our best shot, it didn't work. Right. So I just would encourage everyone, and I completely agree with Tim's approach of this is an area where if we can share best practices, all the boats will rise with that tide. That we don't have to look at it as only we have the secret sauce and we better keep it and not tell anybody else how to do it. I think everyone can get better by sharing those best practices across the industry.
And Bill, you've got a particular interest and expertise in this. I don't know if you would agree with this, but I think this is a marathon. Unfortunately, we tend to look for quick fixes. And at the end of the day, I think your comment about analytics, we need to have analytics and we need to study it, understand it, and celebrate the wins, even if they're going to be very small. And where we don't have the wins, then the question is, well, how do we reinvent ourselves or do it differently? But this is something that it's going to be a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year process, probably to get where we want to be. And probably we're not going to get the same place in the same locations around the world or in the same diseases at the same time, et cetera. So I think we have to me, really have our metrics around this, know what our baseline is, and then be able to look at where we're succeeding and where we're falling short.
How is CTI specifically working on this diversity problem as regards to getting diversity in clinical research?
I would say on multiple levels, from the very beginning, and Bill highlighted this earlier, as for instance, in our regulatory consulting group who is working with FDA and EMA every day, is we have been one of the early organizations to develop these diversity plans, which, as Bill mentioned, are going to become mandated and standard. And I suspect not just in the US, but other places around the world in the coming years. So at the very early planning stages, I think to be at the forefront of asking the tough questions and trying to put those plans in place. I think then beyond that, once we reach the place of having a protocol, to make sure the protocol considerations at the earliest point in time are being developed to encourage diversity. And then I think once you get to a point of actually activating a study, to use our databases, to use our business intelligence to say which sites and which investigators have been particularly good in this in the past, and make sure that we are contacting them, encouraging them to participate. And then once the study launches, I think you get to the last stage of, okay, now we've tried to do our homework at steps 1, 2, and 3. Now the study is actually starting to screen and enroll. I think then you have to keep a focus on this and make sure that you're thinking in terms of not just are we screening and enrolling patients, and are we making progress against timelines and budget, but are we making progress against the diversity plans that were outlined, maybe a year or 2 or 3 earlier.
Well, Tim, Bill, thank you so much for taking time today to talk to us on this very important topic. And thank you a lot.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and if you enjoy discovering how medicine is moving forward or are interested in how CTI could help with your clinical research, be sure to subscribe, follow us on LinkedIn, or visit our website, ctifacts.com.